Good evening, everyone. Bienvenue. Welcome to today's webinar, Is DEI Being Tuned Out? The Realities of Black Leadership in 2026. My name is Anais Lauriston, and I am responsible for the alumni community's portfolio here at Concordia. I'm happy to see so many of you joining us today. We're going to start off with a quick sound check. Please look at the bottom center of your screen. The icon titled chat is the chat box. Please click it and let me know if you can hear me okay by sending me a message. Perfect. Thank you so much for that. While we meet today on a virtual platform, it is customary to begin our events with a territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Concordia's campuses are located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Ganyogahaga Nation is recognized as the custodian of the lands and waters on and near where Concordia is today. Montreal, or Jajage, is historically known as the gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other people within the Montreal community. Again, thank you all for being here with us. There were about 160 registrations for this discussion, which is very exciting. This session will be recorded. If you happen to experience any technical issues, feel free to drop a message in the chat, and my colleague Sylvia and I will do our best to assist you. Please note that there will be a question and answer period at the end of the discussion, so please use the Q&A box to ask your questions when the time is right. I now have the pleasure of introducing our moderators. This webinar is being hosted by the Black Alumni Network and will be moderated by co-president Rashida Geddes and network member Isaiah Joyner. Rashida Geddes, BA 11, is a senior manager of talent management at Bell. She is a speaker, coach, and trainer who helps emerging leaders gain clarity in their careers and lives. Rashida has been featured on many media networks and has spoken across Canada and the US. Isaiah Joyner, BComm 21, MBA 25, is a consultant at CGI where he supports leadership teams with portfolio governance and financial forecasting. He also serves as national co-lead of CGI's Reach Employee Resource Group, where he shapes national strategy and advises mentors as emerging leaders. So now I do have the pleasure of handing it over to Rashida, who will introduce our lovely speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anais, and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you all that are joining us today. So let me invite our esteemed panelists to the stage. We have Ramatou N, BComm 08, is an accomplished HR leader and strategist with more than 15 years of experience building and leading people functions across global corporations, public institutions, and academia. She is currently the Director of HR and Talent Development at Université de l'Ontario, Français, where she has been instrumental in designing the institution's HR ecosystem. Welcome, Ramatou. Next, we have Temi Akin Aina, is a senior higher education advancement and alumni relations leader with over 15 years of experience in program strategy, community building, and inclusive engagement. She is currently the Director of Alumni Experience at UNSW Sydney, where she leads a refreshed alumni strategy for more than 400,000 alumni. She is also the former Associate Director of Alumni Relations at Concordia University. Welcome to the stage, Temi. And we have as well, Michael Dennis, BComm 90, began his career in corporate accounting at the Business Development Bank of Canada before transitioning into technology roles. In 2010, he co-founded Tomont Solutions, building it into a leading Canadian boutique consulting firm. It was later acquired by KPMG in 2017. He went on to serve as partner at KPMG and a leader in diversity initiatives before returning in 2023 to lead a consulting practice delivering cloud-based technology solutions to major Canadian organizations. Please welcome to the stage, Michael Dennis. Great. So you know now, just by reading those bios, the kind of experience that we have in this virtual room and in this virtual space. So I want to start off with the first question. Around 2020, right? 2020, when we look back at that time, you know, George Floyd was the catalyst. So many things were happening to accelerate DEI efforts in Canada and around the world. When we look back at those initiatives, do you think that those initiatives, and I'll point this question first to start off at Temi. Do you think that these initiatives were ever designed to shift power or mostly to ease public pressure? And what did you see inside the rooms you were in, and what can leaders take away from that? So, Temi, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for the question, Rashida. I think that the piece that I would like to start with is just by centering some of the language and the opportunity and what was going on. So when we talk about DEI, what does that actually mean? So, the word diversity is around the presence and participation of people with varying backgrounds and perspectives, especially those who were traditionally underrepresented. Equity is about equal access to opportunities and fair and just impartial treatment. And inclusion is about a sense of belonging in an environment where all feel welcomed, accepted, and respected. And so I think that, just by framing the conversation around what DEI actually means and the words that we're speaking of is useful as we begin, this conversation over the course of the evening. The context that I come from, which you mentioned in the introduction, is that of higher education, particularly within a Canadian setting. And so, what those conversations about DEI, born of the George Floyd riots and what was going on in the United States, was an opportunity for many institutions, particularly Canadian institutions, to take a look at the ideals behind DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and what that actually meant on campuses. And so, I push back against the notion that perhaps it is just window dressing, because a lot of institutions actually did a lot of work around who are the students that are on campus? Have we traditionally recognized their belonging on campus? A lot of institutions may have had smaller teams devoted to students of color, whether that be Black students. They may not have had Black studies minors, scholarships. They may not have had frameworks or opportunities to look structurally and institutionally about how you support, reward, and the variable treatment of Black students, Black staff, Black academics within those institutions. And so a lot of work was done there that I believe has created at least opportunities for a bit more of that equality, that equity, that access. Now, I think one of the other points here is around the distinction between kind of the individual and the structural, right? So 2020 allowed for more institutions to look at this from a structural place. And then within institutions, I would say, what are individuals able to do? How are you able to move forward within those institutions? How are you able to take advantage of some of those, whether they are scholarships or those programs? And I think that that's where we have opportunities and as individuals to hold institutions accountable for what they have said that they would do, or how they, or for what their policies are, and to ensure and hold up whether those are being uplifted in the same way, regardless of who the individual may be or what they look like. I also think one of the opportunities to provide nuance in this conversation is also to think about representation and individual representation as being just that. Individual representation is just that. It is not symbolic. It is just a piece of data when you consider the context. So, we are now at many institutions, or many of us will have companies where there are more Black people in leadership. There are more women in leadership. But this does not mean that if those opportunities are not there for more people of diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives, to either, move up in those companies, move up in those organizations, and to be treated in the same way, then we have to, as individuals, perhaps call that out. Depends on how safe you are in that context, but really to think about the way in which the opportunity is represented and who is able to take to participate in those. So I would say that those are my initial comments. I think that the structure of the 2020s and the structure of DEI allowed many more institutions and companies to think more deeply about the ways in which diverse individuals were experiencing and participating in life in those environments.
Thank you, Temi, for sharing that. I think we all definitely saw from an institutional perspective the changes and the shifts, as well as the opportunities that came out in 2020. I'd love to open it up for some of our other panelists. When you think of the corporate space, what did you see in 2020? What did leadership and power look like inside of your rooms that you were in?
So I guess I'll go. I think I would say that for certain organizations who were already dedicated to diversity within there, things opened up quite a bit, right? So the original question was it just window dressing? For many organizations, it was just window dressing. They wanted to get ahead of it. But I think organizations who were committed and serious about it did create those opportunities, whether it had been, I hate saying opening doors because it wasn't opening doors. It was just allowing us to be seen through those doors, right? So allowing people in our community to advance within organizations, and also looking at the other generations and trying to help, and we'll talk about that later, fund what was going on in other organizations. So I think that there has been some pullback in the news and in the media, but those who were truly committed continue to be committed. They just might call it something different.
I love that perspective, Michael, around, the organizations that really meant it, leverage the opportunity to really continue to shed light and really give opportunities to employees that were already great and were already doing good things. So I love your perspective on it, Michael, and how the corporate space was doing. I'll pass it over to Isaiah now, my co-moderator, to lead the next one.
Okay, on the topic, we're like similar to what Michael just said about the MAB being tuned out but called different. There seems to be a shift in the narrative based off different people's opinions and what's going on in the climate. So when people say that DE&I is over or being phased out, what does that signify to you in your respective fields and roles? And what do you think is driving this narrative, especially here in Canada? And when this narrative is discussed, how should we gauge what is reality, especially with like now with tools like AI, where you can't tell the difference between like real news or authentic people and what's AI generated content? We can start with you, Ramatou.
Yeah, thank you for having me and thank you for the question. From an HR and governance perspective, the first thing I'll say, I'll kind of like mirror what Temi said earlier, is that DI means different things in different organizations. So you'll have some organization that'll look at it as a philosophy or social justice commitment. Others will look at it at programs, committees, practical processes. But often for us in HR, it's going to be in policies and hiring practices. We're looking at accommodation processes, training access, harassment, discrimination processes, and all of those are very deeply rooted in HR and in law. So in my role, when people are saying DI is phased out or over, I don't see the work disappearing. I see it more like being reabsorbed into governance, compliance, and leadership systems. In some places, it's being rebranded. So they're using different terms to name the same set of work. In others, it's being quietly reinforced. And we've seen some cases where it's being publicly doubled down on, companies kind of calling out how they're committing to it. At the same time, I want to be clear because I did notice that for many people, feeling that it's phased out, it feels very real. Some roles were cut, budget disappeared, consulting work ended sometimes abruptly. So career have been disrupted, and people, when they feel lost, it's not a theory, it's lived experience. So I want to recognize that. So when DEI does move back into functions like HR, like myself, executive committees, compliance structures, what it does is that it becomes a little less visible. It's no longer the collective and public effort that we've seen in 2020. It becomes institutional work happening behind the scenes. So when people don't see it, a lot of times they feel and assume that the work is just gone or it's not happening anymore. After 2020, as my colleague said earlier, a lot of companies moved super quickly. Some of them, like Michael said, did some deep work. Many complied under pressure. We need to call it what it is. And what we're seeing now is that we're sitting in the discomfort of that with that sustained scrutiny. And we're getting to see how leaders and institution really felt about DEI all along. I don't think it's backlash for us or for me in HR. It's data, it's information, and it tells us whether the commitment was structural or whether it was situational, whether it was reactive. And it creates an opportunity for more honest conversation about what actually really works when it comes to diversity and inclusion. In Canada, we haven't seen the same level of rollback as in the US. And I think it's partly because in Canada, equity is embedded into a legal framework, into public sector mandate. Temi spoke about the post-secondary education. There are a lot of regulations that protect students, and also with our efforts pertaining to reconciliation. So I don't think DEI is disappearing. I think it's being institutionalized. And the risk, as I see it, is not legal rollback because we have a very robust system in Canada. I think it's really the leadership intent. When the work is more subtle and the public it's no longer publicly amplified or glorified. You don't see it on LinkedIn as we used to see. And it's no longer institutionally prioritized. The question is, are leaders still having the courage to show up for what's right, even when they don't get the support of the movement? When it comes to technology, my colleague spoke about it. There's a lot of, odd things happening on social media these days. I think it forces us to exercise more discernment, and really take a step back to really look at the information for what it is, because AI will amplify narratives. It will make the nuances that my colleague mentioned a little harder to see. And it could make, single event look like a universal or a global trend. So we need to be careful when it comes to that. So we can't measure reality by the headlines and everything that we see. We really need to look at data, and looking at things very specific, like who's getting hired, who's getting developed, who's getting protected, who's being promoted, who's being retained. That's the data that will ultimately give us insight as to what's happening to DEI. It's not just a program. For me, it's more of a pattern. It's a trend. We were at the height of it in 2020, and just like everything else, it's facing a little bit of disruption, but that doesn't mean that it's going anywhere. I think it's just going through its national phase. And the question is, how do we adjust today to maintain the momentum and not lose all the work that was done?
Okay, thank you, Ramatou, for that insightful answer. I'll open it up to our other panelists. Temi.
Thank you, Isaiah. Thank you, Ramatou. I think that was really lovely and a great encapsulation of some of the nuances of the question. I think one of the points I wanted to just follow on that Ramatou mentioned and brought up is around the effects of technology. And so I think, at least from what Ramatou was saying, the way I see that is particularly misinformation and the generation of perhaps artificial consensus. And so with AI, with the ability now to perhaps use bots to, drive certain themes and tropes, I think that what we are also seeing as part of this is that what we may be perceiving as the backlash to DEI is maybe just driven by some very loud voices. And so that's not to say that we're not, that there aren't, whether it's rollbacks or that it's being institutionalized. But I think that it's just a reminder too about the voices also having a dampening effect. So we are now probably in a period of time where leaders may believe that if you speak out against DEI, that there are risks to speaking out, for or against DEI. And so that is also adding to a situation and an environment in which people are no longer as empowered to be more boldly for the values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also the misinformation around what it is. And so a lot of people claiming that DEI efforts are about quotas when that's not actually what they are about. And so I think that that's also an element of this conversation. And so just asking, for our graduates, alumni, people in the rooms to really be critical of who is saying some of these things, where are they coming from, and how that is being reflected in both the actions and the words of people having these conversations.
You bring up a good point, Temi, that people are looking at this and saying that it's all about quotas. And I think many of us in our community went into this looking for it to not be about quotas, but really look for all of the acronyms, right? To have DEI within organizations. And in some cases, it got co-opted, right? Whether it be by other underserved communities, the message got co-opted, and that's what made us lose the whole inclusion, right? We excluded other groups to the benefit of some of the underserved groups. And that's why I think there's a little bit of fatigue with what people are perceiving as DEI, because it's not serving the purpose that it's meant to serve, which is bringing everybody under the table, not giving you a job because you're Black, but giving you an opportunity despite the fact that you're Black. And I think that's what's been missed.
Thank you, Michael, Temi, Ramatou, all really valuable points that you've mentioned. You know, I heard support, you know, institutional. I heard, you know, follow the data. I've heard, you know, not paying attention to the misinformation and really taking advantage of the opportunities. I'd like to now follow the money. Based on your experiences, what do current funding or investment patterns show about how serious institutions are really taking equity today? And what does that mean for Black leaders trying to drive change with underfunded systems? I'd like to start with Michael. What are you seeing when it comes to following the money and financing today?
Yeah, I think it's an important question, right? Whenever you want to know if somebody's really committed, follow the money. And I think the question is great. So Ramatou made the point earlier that many organizations are embedding DEI into their systems, which is great in terms of being able to help those who are already out there in the working space. For many and for me, I think part of what came out of DEI, the 2020 movement, and what we started talking a lot about DEI was, how do we break down systemic barriers that have been put up for people in underserved communities? And part of that is through investment, right? Through dollars, whether that be investing in scholarships, whether that be giving internships to those who haven't had the opportunities, whether it be working with partner firms or other organizations who are in underserved communities who don't get the opportunity. Again, not that they're not qualified, but they don't get the opportunity. And I think it goes further. I think it should also be looking at your whole supply chain. So if I work with other organizations and they want to get they want to work with me, then they need to also have in place policies so that they're also so that they're also not discriminating against other folks. So I think that whole idea of how you spend your money and where you put your money is very important. I am seeing now where organizations are starting to pull back, at least in the corporate world. The investment dollars aren't there for whatever it might have been. Scholarship money is drying up. Funding for programs is drying up. So that's going away. But I think there are still a lot of good things out there. And I think it's more in the, I'll call it the private sector, the smaller organizations. There are a lot of organizations who are out there who are still trying to fund businesses, whether they be small businesses, whether they be entrepreneurs. The BDC has just come out with a $100 million program to fund Black businesses. So there are still ways to get out there. And I think as leaders, what we need to look at is within organizations, we need to continue to push and hold those other folks accountable. But for many on the line, I think if it's not working for you within an organization and you're able and capable, sometimes you need to go out and start your own, right? Start your own firm, start your own businesses, and then you can apply what you believe are your values and your policies within the organization. I realize that's not for everybody, but for those who can, entrepreneurship is a way for you to also apply those policies.
Such valuable and great insights, Michael, from the corporate space and what's happening. We do see, you know, a difference in dollars being allocated for some of these initiatives. And I love your point on, you know, if you don't find the opportunity, create your own. Temi, Ramatou, when you think of academia, when you think of the spaces that you're in, are you seeing the same trend of financing for equity-based initiatives disappearing or being pulled back? What are you seeing on your end?
I will say that with regards to higher education and universities, because of the broad scope of students and the fact that students come from everywhere, I think that you know, a little bit to Michael's point earlier about those who are thoughtful. And I think that most universities are trying to do this work in a thoughtful way. It does come back to, were these funding and financing investments and supports, were they actually institutionalized, or were they put in as ad hoc? We will support this while it's going on. And so I think that those are some of that I think that was the key point that I wanted to flag around the financing and investment, and the importance also of paying attention to what is specifically being said and the way in which it is being supported. And for those on the other side of this, if you're Black, if you're a person of color, if you're working in an institution or in this framework where financing is tied to identity, I think what we are seeing is that if it is solely tied to identity, then that can change on a dime. And so it's also important to be really pragmatic about if you are under a scholarship that may be tied to diversity, unless this is endowed or something like that, then you really do need to be aware about, if you can, and sometimes institutions can be opaque, but there is a need, I believe, for a certain level of pragmatic idealism. If you are in an institution and money has not been fully allocated for a program or a platform, it may mean that might go away. And so, being aware of the levers that you can pull on, or just even being aware of the fact that to really take advantage of the opportunity while it exists, because it may not exist the entire time.
I love that point, Temi, around pulling on different levers. I think people may have gotten comfortable pulling on the lever of diversity and maybe thinking that opportunity would be there. But I think that there are other areas that we can pull from. And I think that's a very valid point, and an interesting one for those listening in. Over to you.
Okay. So as a finance guy, I know about the numbers and we often follow the money, but we often don't talk enough about the toll or the human cost or the human capital, where we've all been in spaces where we've been the first, maybe Black partner, Black academic, Black director, and that what that means and is you often have to educate your non-Black peers or really do a lot of that emotional labor, deal with the microaggressions. And so we're just curious to know about how seeing the rise of DE&I in terms of like at its peaks and its valleys and through 2020s now to the kind of like deprioritization that we're seeing some organizations face, whether financially, legally, or like all of the above. How has that impacted your leadership style or your portfolios as both a professional and I guess as an individual as well? And open to all. So Ramatou.
I can certainly start, because I mentioned earlier that a lot of it is reabsorbed into our work. It's an interesting question for me because my experience has been shaped mainly by working in HR and in institutional leadership roles. So when you're responsible for policies, investigation, accommodation, all that good stuff, you're in caretaker mode. So you're basically protecting the system and the people and making sure that things are working the way they're supposed to work. So for a very long time, I didn't experience myself as the only in the emotional sense of the term, because I was just busy taking care of making sure things were working. And in some ways, I recognized that did insulate me, but in other ways, it also meant that I was carrying another type of weight in my role. It was responsibility without a lot of space to really process everything. And I think a lot of my HR colleagues can resonate with what I'm saying. During the height of the DEI conversation, what happened was that there was more recognition for all that invisible labor and all that invisible work. And now that the attention has shifted back, much of that work is still happening. We're still doing the work. It's just, a lot more discreet and quiet again. So for me, the biggest impact didn't go from like being visible to being invisible. I think it was more like sustainability. Because at that point, the question you're asking yourself is how do you continue doing this work with integrity without burning yourself out, without becoming cynical? And that's why I think it's very important for these conversations to be maintained. We were talking about budgeting earlier, with nobody advocating for it when you're having competing mandates and emergencies. It's very easy for topics like DI to just fall down on the line and no budget being allocated to it. So when representation is thin, I think we have a responsibility to continue, even though it could be tedious, even though maybe the support is not what it used to be, use our influence to continue to open doors for others in any way that we can, because the progress is an ongoing. I think DEI is a journey. I think a lot of people are looking at it as a final result or some magical thing, but it's actually work that's going to be ongoing. It's permanent. We're going to be working at it all the time, and we need to keep that in mind and prepare for that long stretch and that long work, because it's not going to be stopping. It's not going to be anytime soon. So with people in responsibility roles or minorities like ourselves, I think the job is to keep pushing, making sure that the conversation continues, even when it's uncomfortable, as Temi said, and sometimes you're not feeling safe enough to speak out about it, to still have that courage to keep the conversation going.
We do stand on the shoulders of giants, and it can be hard to remember that this is more of a relay race rather than a sprint. So we respect that invisible effort and always appreciated it. Temi?
Thank you, Isaiah. Thanks, Ramatou. I think I'm going to say something that may be a bit controversial. I'm not sure. I don't think individuals can provide the entire response to structural inequity. And so I say that a little bit around this to kind of free myself and any others of having to, really kind of carry that burden and baggage of being the only one. And so the way that I handle that is that if I am the only one, then that also speaks to the structure of that does occur, and I say that having moved to Australia, where the representation of Black people is much smaller here, so I find myself smiling at people on the street like a weirdo, but it's all solidarity and community, and so I think that some of the pieces around this would be that, in that instance, are there opportunities within the structure for greater conversations about equity? I think that it is generally a trap to be the only one in a room. And so, if there are ways in which you as a leader can see to have more equitable opportunities to bring in diverse perspectives onto a team, so that you are no longer the only person standing up for an entire group or community or anything like that, that is always going to provide for, I'd say, a more advantageous workplace perspectives, et cetera. And I think that the other thing I wanted to speak to around this question of being the only one, I think also that we can use structures to their advantage, right? So Ramatou earlier had pointed out about the institutionalization. And so if there are instances where there are context comments that are very clearly racist, inappropriate, or there are things occurring that do not live up to values, I would say that sometimes, rather than personalizing, saying this is not aligned with your stated, system, structures, values, and offering that as a way to begin that conversation and perhaps depersonalize, because when you are a person of color, often it is framed as, oh, you're only taking offense because of your identity. And so in these situations, really saying, if this is what the structure upholds as the ideal, then let's all try to support that and call out when it's not.
Thank you, Rashida.
Yeah. So Temi, you brought up some good points in there that I think will speak to this next question. In environments where diversity, equity, and inclusion is being questioned, scaled back, Temi, you talked about blatant racism. What practical strategies help leaders remain effective? Whether it's building allies, leveraging their strengths, advancing opportunities, even amidst the resistance that they may be feeling, what can they do to navigate this space? And Ramatou, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll kind of bounce off of what Temi was saying earlier. And I'm going to answer this from a perspective of like individual agency. Essentially, how do you survive and advance in a system that is imperfect? because for most of us in the room, as Temi said that really, really nicely, is that we can't control the institution, but we can control how we navigate within it. And one uncomfortable truth that businesses want to avoid saying is that a lot of the inequities are not happening because people are bad, or at least, as HR professional, we operate with the principle that people are intentionally good. um, it's typically caused by unmanaged system. And I think Michael spoke about I think he spoke about systemic barriers. It's how the roles are scoped sometimes, or how performance is being evaluated, how potential is recognized, how you get high visibility stretch assignments that will help you build that executive credibility to grow in your career, how mistakes that you make are being interpreted. Because for a lot of us, the systems, because that's what we've always known, they seem neutral and they're rarely questioned, but in reality, the burden falls on the individual. And if you're a Black leader, it falls on you to adapt, to either overperform or self-correct around structures that sometimes may not have been designed with you in mind. So that does shape how we see the expectations in a very subtle way. So you have to be at the same time super resilient, super strategic, and at the same time not cause any trouble all at once. I think the standard could be a little bit high. So in environments where DI is being questioned or scaled back, and as a Black person, we're trying to figure out how to navigate, I would say that there would be three strategies that I would probably recommend. The first one is really building those alliances. Rashida, you mentioned that, and we're talking about not performative alliances. We're really talking about people that actually know you and what you do and what you contribute, so that they can speak to it when you're not around and you're not in the room. The second I would say is leverage your strength. What do you do well, and ensure that it's visible and it's a strength that's actually directly impacting business outcomes. So really tying that line between the two and make that visible. The third is, I know that, the HR in me is document everything. You're documenting your decisions, your contributions, anything that you see. And you're not doing that out of fear, but mostly because you're being a professional, keeping track of all the great things that you're doing and how you're contributing. And the last thing I could say, especially in this day and age, it's to protect your self-trust. I believe deeply that in a stable environment, it's that much more important to be clear about who you are and what you stand for. And that becomes your unique selling feature. It becomes your unique leadership skill that you're going to use, and that's going to be your compass throughout your career. So in situations of resistance, you don't retreat. It just means that you have to move with more intention. You have to use more data to support what you're doing, and you have more discernment.
I love that, Ramatou. Move with intention is something that I stand on fully, and the idea that you really have to move in the way that you align yourself with. Michael, anything that you'd like to add to that?
I think it's just very difficult to find organizations out there that align with their values, right? In order to be able to be comfortable in any organization, you hope that it aligns with your values. So you have to move with intention, and hopefully, not changing jobs isn't an easy thing, but position your career, if you can, if you're in the business world, to a place where you can find a place that supports your values, supports what you're trying to do. In the meantime, while you're there, not all of it can be on this one person, right? So you need to continue to, as we said, build allies within organizations, but you just need to figure out what is the right spot within that organization. Sometimes there's nothing you can do internally. If you can't do it internally, go externally. Work with other organizations, work with kids to help them advance and realize their goals. It doesn't always have to be from within. Again, the whole goal is to break down systemic barriers and bring everybody up, not just yourselves. Okay? So I think as leaders, we can't just look internally to one place. We have to look at all the systemic barriers, and where we can, help out.
Such great points. You reminded me of someone knocking on a door, and they're continuously knocking on that same door. And instead of going somewhere else and knocking on a door that may be willing to open itself up for you, you're continuously knocking on that same one. So I love that opportunity about setting yourself up for other opportunities, other spaces that align more with your values.
Yeah.
in some instances where you can, for sure. Isaiah, back over to you.
Okay. So the penultimate question in terms of, they say insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results, right? And if DE&I, the purpose was to address some of those systemic barriers that you mentioned, Michael, in terms of shifting organizational behaviors, perceptions, and all that. If the current frameworks are losing momentum, what is one thing that should take their place, whether it be like a mindset, a structure, or a practice that we as leaders, next generation, whether retirees, like everybody in the community could help to kind of build that momentum back in something that would not necessarily be the current DE&I framework we have? And I'll start with you, Temi.
I love that we came to me first. I actually I believe that DEI is still valuable. I think we're just calling it different things now. I think that wanting different people's perspective represented, wanting there to be fairness and justice, as well as allowing for people to feel that they belong. I think those are all good things. So I am still a fan of what DEI represents, though I will say that as a pragmatic person, I'm happy for people to call it whatever, as long as you are thinking about the policies and the standards and the values that mean that we want to have, workplaces and schools that reflect the world and allow, as many people as possible to be able to live dignified human lives and to thrive without being unfairly held back due to things that are outside of their control. So I don't know that I am advocating a shift, but I think that DI actually helps us all. And that it allows for a more thoughtful and consistent world, and that's the world I'd like to live in.
If it's not broke, you don't have to fix it.
Well, so I think the ultimate goal is we don't need DEI, right? It's so that everybody is treated equally and fairly all the time. You made the point, Isaiah, though, that this is a marathon, right? It's not a sprint. And for DEI, at least in my mind, to be truly effective, it's not just about funding, it's not just about programs, it's about changing hearts and minds so that people come into it and they look at everybody equally. But that's not something that you can teach necessarily, especially to people who are older in the workplace. They have to live it and believe it. So changing hearts and minds takes a long time. I don't know that there's anything that we do, especially today, or we can say, do this 1, 2, 3, 4 things, and that will make DEI more successful, or whatever we're calling it. I think we have to continue on that long road and continue to push, right? With these programs, and make people aware of some of the systemic barriers that are out there at every opportunity that we have, so that they can see it. They might not believe it, they might not want to hear it, but I think that's the responsibility that we carry.
Thank you. Those both comments are particularly insightful. I'm going to sound a little bit boring here, but if I had to mention something to replace DEI, for me in HR, it would be embedded accountability. So that, just like, Michael said, it just literally, we don't talk about it anymore because it's part of how we operate anyways. It's not a program, it's not a committee, and it's not a slogan. It's essentially just how we run business. I've always imagined that, if a DEI position was to, is open in a business, one of the targets of that job is for that job to eventually not be needed. That should be one of the objectives of the job, to make it so that it's no longer in a silo, because the moment you give it a title, you kind of like extract it from the entire organization to make it embedded in. So it goes through, for me, clear expectations for leaders. A lot of people still don't know what their role is and what it looks like to contribute positively to that effort. So we need to have clear expectations for leaders. We have to measure the outcomes. We have to track to see if there are gaps and how we breach those gaps. Because if when equity becomes part of how performance is measured, I think at that point, it stops being optional. People don't have to pick between doing what's fair versus running the business. It's integrated. To do your business, you have to do what's fair. When you're combining that way, it becomes less optional and it becomes a lot easier for us to hold everybody accountable. Transformation and change takes a lot of effort and it takes time. If you're not measuring it, when people get into the heat of things, they get distracted, they'll fall back into what they know. So this is an effort that needs to be completely integrated. And of course, I know that I'm saying it sounds super simple said like that, but I understand how complex of a challenge it is.
Yes, and from what I'm gathering from your different answers, putting it all together, where it's like, ideally, we would not need a DE&I. We wouldn't need a department or a role to fix it. It's like we would just address those systemic barriers by removing them and allowing it to naturally take part and reflect in the person who is genuinely most qualified will get the job, and almost the population will start to look a little bit more like the global population rather than just that systemic, repetitive, like isolation that we see without these D&I practices.
Definitely think
Thank
that
you.
that's a beautiful world that we'll one day live in. But I think right now we're probably all working through the different elements. What I love about what you mentioned, Ramatou, is what doesn't get measured doesn't get done. And the gold is in the data, all right? It's in the information and what the data is telling you about your organization. So many valuable things that you've said there, Ramatou. And now we're opening it up. I know there were some questions that have already come into the chat. We've received some questions as well ahead from those that have registered. So if you have any questions, please use the Q&A chat feature to add your question there. And I'm going to start off with a question that came in during the registration process. This question came from Lester. In a climate where DEI, language, and programs can get deprioritized or tuned out, so we talked about that, what are the most resilient anchors you've seen? Tying inclusion to user safety, quality, accessibility, market expansion, risk management, without diluting the underlying purpose. So I know we talked about the tuning out, but what concrete anchors, measures have you seen that have actually worked, either in your organizations or the spaces that you've been in?
Well, I can speak to higher education to a certain extent. And with higher education, particularly around 2020, a lot of institutions essentially signed on to compacts around the student experience. So whether that was allowing for the creation or moving towards curricular changes around curricular changes or opportunities for, say, a Black Studies minor or Black Studies major. Creating structures for more scholarships for underrepresented students. So at certain institutions, they started creating alternative pathways to medical school for students from underrepresented backgrounds. So I believe that some of those opportunities, I think, that there is room here for us to say, like, are there actual strategies that are institutionalized, that are formalized within, if it is a university, are there scholarships, or, is it going through a curricular process? I think those are some of the anchors that we can see. I think the other piece from the background of us being individuals, and Michael mentioned it, Ramatou mentioned it as well, is the fact that collective action will often be needed, right? And so this stuff is not going to happen today or tomorrow. So it has to really be that, in some of these scenarios, you do have to connect with colleagues to say, this is not right. These are the things that we are seeing, as Ramatou mentioned, show the data and accept that it might take some time, but this is not where you take your foot off the gas, that we are factual and clear about what is occurring, and also really pushing for accountability where we can.
Thank you, Temi. Ramatou?
Yeah, in Canada, like I mentioned earlier, we're lucky because we do have a legal system that recognizes equality for all in face of the law. So it's unfortunately a long unpleasant and sometimes not very dignified route, but it is an anchor that delivers results. What we don't want is for that. It's kind of like the punishment. We want people to do the right thing right away, but if they don't, there is an anchor. And for us in HR, it serves as kind of like the story that you tell people so that they behave better. I know that it's kind of like the carrot and the stick, but those are strong anchor because the Canadian legal framework recognizes equality of all and access to all equally. And for us in HR, those are some of the things that we hold on to, because regardless on, political cycles, corporate trends, whatever, those still stand and they stand strong. It's not sexy, it's not pretty, but it works.
Thank you, Ramatou. Really insightful.
Okay. I'm going to do a little bit of a mashup because we have a pre-selected question from Pamela, and we also have a question in our Q&A from Louise, where the question from Pamela was, how can hiring managers improve DE&I in the recruitment/interview process? And taking that Luis's question was directed directly to you, Ramatou, so you can kind of start with the answer there, where it's like, you spoke of measuring D&I success, and what do you see as the most relevant KPI to measure it, and how can we make it more than just a quota game, as was mentioned, and measure the quality of the experience, D&I? And I felt that both of them kind of like were addressing the same thing. So the first part can be maybe specified in the recruitment and interview process, and then maybe a little bit broader in terms of you as an HR professional, what are those KPIs that, and to your previous point about the not so pretty reality that you're facing internally, it's like, what are those metrics that are going to stand out to get us to where we're going?
Yeah, thank you. Those are really good questions. In terms of hiring practices, um, first of all, the job description has to be worded in a way that it does not exclude anybody, and that for anybody reading it, they don't feel that they don't fit what is required. So there's a little bit of cleanup to be done, or a scrutiny in terms of how things are worded in the job description, because what that does is that it opens the pool and you have the representation in the applicants. Where you post the jobs as well matters. You have to make sure that it's available to all the communities so that you get enough representation in your pool of candidates. But then when it gets to the process, we operate with committees. And I have found that to be useful because you're getting multiple perspective around the table, not just the hiring manager, HR, and the candidate. So you're getting, and when you're choosing the committee, making sure that there's representation in the committee that you're picking goes a long way. Providing some training. I know that the unconscious bias training has had its fair share of criticism, but if you have nothing else, you can start with that. Training the committee on unconscious bias, and then the interview questions, ensuring that it's also removing any bias to ensure that you're not leading or promoting a certain type of experience. So those little things are little things that you can put in place to help with better results in terms of the quality of the hires that you're going to get. There are definitely a lot more sophisticated strategies out there, but just starting with those already improves the odds. The second question, when it comes to KPIs, one of the things I remember somebody saying, "Oh my God, you guys are doing great with diversity," and I said, because we had a lot of people from all over the world, and I said, the data is incomplete because we are a startup, so we just started. You have to come back in a couple of years and we can look at these diversity and look at how many of them have gone up the ranks. That's going to be your measure of how diverse the business is, right? So these are things. How many underrepresented groups are getting opportunities to climb up the ladder? How many of them are getting opportunities, checking for those data and keeping track of it? When you're looking at turnover rate as well, how many of them have a tendency to leave? And then when you're doing surveys, internal survey, that's when you're checking in on the well-being. How are people feeling? And you break it down by looking at how your underrepresented community feel for those metrics, as opposed to bundling it as the data for everybody. So those are a few KPIs that you can look at to kind of have an assessment of how your population is doing. So like I said, number one, how many you have in total in the general population, how many of them are going up the rank, and then turnover rate, how many of them are leaving. And when you're doing engagement surveys, really be a little bit grounded on to see how the experience of underrepresented groups are compared to the rest of the population.
Great.
Thank you.
Great advice. There's a question that we had from Zensa. Zensa has actually asked a couple of times this question, and I think that there is a sense of a frustration I can sense from the question. Why do you think in 2026 we cannot, as Canadians, be selected for jobs and opportunities based on our skills and accomplishments, instead of creating these categories of what the bureaucracy labels marginalized? Any food for thought, anything, any perspective that you can provide here to the thought process from Zenza, who's feeling like maybe that they're being tuned out of opportunities, they're being phased out of opportunities, and put in a category where a person can select from multiple diversity groups and not feeling selected. What would you say to someone who is feeling this way?
I mean, it's a tough one, right? I don't think it's you're in the best position if you go into an organization based on a certain group, right? I got hired as the Black person, or I got hired as the woman, or whatever the case, because there's always a target on your back when you go into an organization. So it might sound pat, but I think you have to rise above no matter what you look like, right? You have to be the best. And it's unfortunate to say that sometimes in certain spots where the competition is very high, that's how you're going to get looked at. So they can't ignore you based on your color, because they would really be losing out. Otherwise, Zenza, it's back to people are making some of these decisions when it comes to hiring. And if in their heart and mind they're going to exclude you, there's not much that we can do. It's not the answer you wanted, but that's kind of how I see it, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I say people hire people. Sometimes people hire people who they know and trust, and I put those in air quotes, who they perceive to know or perceive to trust based on similarities, based on the things that they see in them that they can see in themselves. And sometimes, as Michael, you mentioned, that's beyond our control. We can't control how people will see us. We can't control how people will perceive us. We can show up as our best, as you mentioned, Michael, show up as the best, and in different spaces, until the space that aligns with your values, with you, opens that door. And if not, you create your own space, as Michael shared, and you build it from the ground up.
It's a tough thing to do, but sometimes that's what you have to do. I think Ramatou was going to make a point.
I just wanted to say that 2026 is a weird year when it comes to hiring in general. I think everybody has sensed it. The market is just a little bit odd. I think we're trying to figure out what's happening, because a lot of people are complaining about how long it takes to find jobs, right? The cycle just seems to be like stretched out much longer than it is. So I do want to put that into perspective as well. And the other thing that Michael said, which is so on point, when it comes to recruiting strategy, you're essentially trying to figure out which job you would be the most competitive at. It might not be the company that you really, really want, but it might be the company where, because not everybody wants, everybody's like, if it's Apple, obviously they're going to have thousands and thousands of applicants. But if you take another tech company that's a little bit less known, you're increasing your chance. So there's strategy behind that as well. You have to be intentional about where you go to build that resume, build that career before moving into, the pool where the competition is higher. So do consider that as well. Kind of changing the strategy a little bit, where you're going where you know that you're going to be the most competitive, even if it's not your ideal gig, just because it's a little sacrifice you're making for the long-term gain.
I think that's so critical and important, right? It might not be the job that you want, but it's a long career. You've got to put yourself in a position where you'll continue to build and be successful as you move up, hopefully move up.
Absolutely. And since I sense you have some more points on that, I don't think it is fair. There's a lot of spaces that aren't fair. That's why you create, right? If you're in telefilm, if you're creating something, there's an opportunity for you to create something and have those conversations and maybe take it further. But thank you for your question. Isaiah, I'll pass it over to you to ask the next one.
Yes. We have another question from Morgan, which is more so of like, we have allies here on the call. And so people who believe in the cause, they support Black professionals and they see our struggle. Any advice for how leaders who are not Black can support Black leaders in this movement, whether systemically or emotionally? Any advice for them?
I mean, I think they just need to stand up for, sorry, Temi, were you going to say something?
Go ahead. I'll surf your wave after.
I think they need to stand up in the rooms when you're not there, right? I think Temi was making the point earlier. If we hear something that is blatantly racist or wrong, we need to stand up, and our allies need to do the same thing too. All this comes back to people standing up for other people. I think if you can reach out and you see a qualified applicant or a person working in your organization who doesn't look like you, well, you can agree to mentor them or sponsor them, not because you were put together through a program, but because you see potential in somebody. Doesn't matter that they don't have that same background as you. They might be competent. You can go and help them. I think it's just people connecting with people and doing the right thing. I know it sounds pat, it sounds easy, but it all comes down to that.
Yeah, and I would also just say that, to Michael's point, it also doesn't have to be big things. I have been in situations where, people who I consider to be dear friends have said, here's some information that you might not know from this context. And so even in terms of like the organization, so whether it is sharing information around union levels or different things that can help, whether it's Black colleagues, different colleagues from different backgrounds who may not know some of this information. I think people do not know what they don't know. And so the various ways, if you can help mentor or sponsor, then that's useful. If you can't help mentor or sponsor, then being that person who says, oh, Ramatou made a really great point, if Ramatou's point is being, dismissed, or using your agency and the connections you have to say, there are certain members of the team that I think we should give those opportunities. If all of the people you see as promising are people who, have the same background as you, then maybe open up, are there different colleagues that you can build some relationships with and also showcase and share and highlight their skills.
Thank you. That was our last question. I think we're going to transfer over to you, Anna.
And I just want to take a moment to acknowledge we had some questions here in the chat. If we didn't get an opportunity to respond to your question, note that you can connect with us, and I'm sure NIEs will share how you can connect with us if you want to take the conversation further.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Rashida. Rashida's right. So I will have a look at the questions that were left unanswered and circulate them to try and get some responses to you guys via email. I want to say thank you to our panelists for this great and insightful discussion, and thanks to our wonderful moderators as well. For those of you who would like to connect with either our moderators or speakers, their contact links will be in the chat right now. The Black Alumni Network also supports the Foster Black Flourishing Bursary to support Black students with their education. If you enjoy our alumni programming, any donation to the bursary is much appreciated. A link to this bursary will be put in the chat as well. So thank you again to everyone for tuning in today. I look forward to seeing you all again soon.